few minutes of glory here, I'd like to give you a couple of takeaways that I thought were the big messages that ran through the book, and then a couple of question marks that ran through the book. And then I'm sure we're going to talk about the detail of all this later. But I had, actually, before I forget it all, I had it on here. Who's going to help me find my little PowerPoint? I don't want you to think I forget everything, but
First.
yeah,
This one.
that's it. That's all I need. You can breathe easily. I only have one slide, so here's the first takeaway. As you read through all of these chapters, and remember this is worldwide now, and it focuses on developing countries, though sometimes we drift to middle-income countries. And the first thing that I think is noted throughout is the absence of a metropolitan strategy. I mean, Johannes has just given you some basic information about the number of these giant cities around the world. It is a major problem, and they are indeed very different. But you're very hard-pressed to find in many countries anything like a metropolitan strategy. Countries have urban strategies, and countries have rural development strategies, and countries have local government strategies and laws to go with it. But a metropolitan strategy is something we don't have. And the reason why, and apart from politics, the reasons why are that's so hard. I mean, you got a metropolitan area is an economic concept, like a labor market area, with boundaries that ought to be changing all the time, no elected officials, and no champions. So it becomes kind of a planning unit, but there aren't real tools to use for implementation. Yet, the jurisdictions is where the action is. That's where the tools are in terms of revenue and expenditure assignment, but they have fixed boundaries, and they, in fact, do have champions. So here's the question. How in the world do you marry those two concepts in creating a metropolitan strategy? And you would find that running through all of the papers. And you would find it running through the real world. If you visited Buenos Aires, you would see a big city that has developed over time and has grown out to its boundaries. And then you'll see the state of Buenos Aires, which is urban, that has grown to meet the city's boundaries. Yet the notion of shared services can't go anywhere because of that jurisdictional line that runs through. So that's a crucial issue where we're waiting for a breakthrough. Second point is something that we all know and we don't talk about so much, institutional constraints. See, what we like to talk about are resource constraints, and we think that one of the huge problems that you face in these big cities is that they simply don't have the money to get it done. But yet the thread that runs through all of these chapters is if we could remove the harmful institutional constraints, we could go a long way towards solving metropolitan problems. And I'll bet you there's not a person in the room that couldn't talk about it. But by institutional constraints, we mean things like dealing with local government discretion to actually make the right kind of decisions based on local government familiarity with the problem. So mandates, direct regulations, the central government meddling with the civil service, the wage bill being placed in the hands of a higher level government to be paid by a lower level government, denying local government the right to levy taxes in metropolitan areas, but basically leaving them out of the grant system because they're too rich. And, and the list goes on. Johannes wrote a chapter, and he told us that the donors really haven't figured it out yet, that they ought to be concentrating as much on removing these institutional barriers and getting the frame right than on providing more money. So that's a second theme that runs through almost every chapter in this book. Independent authors who came to it, and what's neat about it is they tell the stories based on all different parts of the world, but the story kind of comes out the same. Now 2 questions. One, the variation in the governance and the financing of metropolitan areas is absolutely huge. And you kind of, and you know, you can observe, you could observe that in South Africa and China, they have giant metropolitan areas that function as units. But in Mexico City and Sao Paulo, they have these very small fragmented governments that don't cooperate with each other at all. The Mumbai chapter, to me, was absolutely amazing and incredibly complicated. But what's different about India and a group of places like that are the parastatals and the role that they play in urban finance. So then the natural question is, well, if there's so much variation, what can we learn about what works best? And the answer is not very much. And that's something that shows up in all of these books, and chapters. You get to the end of the story, and what have we really learned about these different practices of governance and finance? And I would be remiss if I didn't get up on the horse with that Johannes and I have been writing since we were children, that nobody has been willing to put together a comparative data set. Do you know we don't have anything like that anywhere in the world? The closest we come are the IMF GFS, but it never touches anything below the aggregate. Finally, there's the question that a lot of people would like to ask, especially practitioners, is whether things are getting better. Are we moving in the right direction? And as you read through the chapters, you'll see that it's a mixed bag. In management practices, clearly, there are significant improvements that have taken place. In terms of removing institutional barriers, maybe not so much has been done. In terms of delivering services on an area-wide basis in a more reasonable way, there are lots of examples of things that have happened. We're finally talking about sustainable cities, thanks to our friends in China. So there are a lot of good things that are going on. But listen, the share of subnational government spending in low and middle income countries is between 13 and 14%. And it's not much. It hadn't moved much in 3 decades. There's a lot of variation in it, but not much. How about this? The tax share of GDP for all levels of government, central and subnational, the tax share of GDP in developing countries is about 17%, and that hadn't changed much in about 30 years. So if you begin to think about it that way, the resources aren't flowing down to that local level through those local budgets, and it kind of gives us pause if we want to say that the evidence is that things are improving significantly. And that theme also runs through all of these chapters. So that's basically what I took away from all of this. I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we'll have about this, and especially about India as the day goes on.
Thank you, Roy. I now invite Mr. Anil Baijal, who's Chairman, National Institute of Urban Affairs and former Secretary Housing in the Government of India, to kickstart the discussion on implications of these messages for India. Thank you.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, the 2 distinguished doctors, for having set the tone for me to discuss with you what are the implications for India. While it did paint a picture not very different from India, so that gives us a lot of confidence that we are not an exception. But to talk more about metropolitan finances, let me first say what is the context of the pace and the pattern of urbanization in India. As you know, in the last 1 decade or so, we have added about 9 million people to our urban scape every year. And the main brunt of all this urban movement has been in the metropolitan areas, has been in the bigger cities. Metropolitan areas, as defined in our constitution, are areas with more than 1 million population. The metropolitan areas, as has been mentioned, are also the main centers of economic growth and activity. But the resources that go to them are totally not commensurate with the role they play in the societies. As a matter of fact, the entire urban sector is relatively a tiny sector. When we look at the levels of revenue of 0.53% of the GDP and expenditure of 1.09%, the main source of revenue for the urban sector is property tax, which is also inefficient. 13th Finance Commission study has shown that in 2006 and 7, 0.15 to 0.23% of GDP was collected through property tax, compared to 0.6% in developing countries, 0.68% in transitional economies, and 1.04% for all countries. Why is it inefficient? Because the tax base is very narrow and constricted. The assessed value lags the market values. Many a time it could be just 8 to 10% of market value. The tax policies get impacted by their effect on the populist programs of the government. Right now, for example, during the elections, we have a serious controversy going on in Punjab as to when would the property tax be implemented or not implemented, because non-implementation would have resulted on non-availability of funds under the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission. And then, of course, there are the issues of tax rate and collection systems inefficiency. Then the issue arises, how do we raise money for the metropolitan regions? For raising this money, you need an organization which has enough power, which has resources, and thirdly, which has the capacity to absorb that kind of money and to be able to deliver what is required. Now, let me mention to you the problems that we have as regards the organization structure. Article 243 of the Constitution gives 3 tiers of categorization of the third tier of democracy. One is the corporation, which is a large urbanized area. Municipality is a smaller urbanized area. And Nagar Panchayats are areas in transition from rural to urban. There is no mention of metropolitan administration. There is no Metropolitan Development Authority under this definition of the Constitution. So some states have managed to set up through statutory instrument the Metropolitan Development Authorities. Some have come through executive orders, but that takes away their basis of operation. Then Article 243ZE, which describes a Metropolitan Planning Committee. So instead of talking about the total administration, where one would take up the role of planning, the role of developing infrastructure, and then create sustainable assets, that is nowhere mentioned. The Metropolitan Planning Committee is an amorphous entity which prepares a plan for approval of the state government, and that too in a regional context. The power and resources that they have are again constricted by the fact that Article 243W, which deals with this subject, says that powers, functions, responsibility, and degree of autonomy of these third tier, which includes the metropolitan level, would be decided by the states. So it's up to the states to decide what powers to give, how much autonomy to give, and how to devolve various resources, including the human capital. Now, if we look at the capacity of these areas to be able to discharge the functions expected of them, we have problems on their competence to handle complex subjects of modern cities, and there's also a problem of